Welcome back, everyone, to our panel on the boundaries of digital enforcement. Hope you're all fully charged and avoiding the day 2 afternoon slump. If not, the session is sure to invigorate you. So I'm going to briefly explain the backdrop to this session. In recent years, governments and institutions have sought to regulate online content, data, and platform accountability. This has been most notable on this side of the Atlantic through new instruments such as the UK Online Safety Act and the EU Digital Services Act. However, in the US, policymakers and state legislatures have also demonstrated significant interest in how to regulate the so-called attention economy. In parallel, regulators are rolling out instruments such as the EU Digital Markets Act and the UK Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act. These are challenging established principles of ex-post competition intervention by imposing ex-ante obligations on large digital players, with the stated aim of leveling the competitive playing field or facilitating contestability and transparency. In legal practice, we're focused on how these regimes are taking shape and how they will be applied. However, if we step back, this is a new frontier, and vigorous debate remains on what constitutes harm in these contexts, how it should be regulated, the extent to which it should be regulated, and who should be responsible for regulating it. Furthermore, many of these questions cannot be adequately addressed without some form of evaluation. This is the case throughout the regulatory lifecycle, whether it's at the stage of design, implementation, or ex-post assessment. Therefore, the core question to be explored by this panel is, how can methods of evaluation contribute to better digital regulatory policy and shape its boundaries? So our first panelist is going to be Hugh Mullan, who is an economics director at Ofcom. His current responsibilities are largely focused on mobile telecoms, postal services, and online safety. And he has a wealth of experience at what seem to be almost all of the key regulators in the British Isles, having served as a regulatory economist at the CMA, the Payment Systems Regulator, and the Irish CCPC. He's also worked in private practice at RBB and Royal Mail, and has published papers on a variety of competition policy issues. So you will be starting us off with a very specific example of evaluation, how Ofcom is exploring the suitability of subjective well-being metrics to assess the impact of the Online Safety Act. We'll then move on to our second panelist, Professor Kai-Uwe Kühn, who will need no introduction to most of this room. Professor Kühn formerly served as the chief economist of DG Comp, and he has spent most of his academic career at the University of Michigan prior to joining the University of East Anglia. His research includes theoretical, experiential, and empirical industrial organization, covering a wide range of topics. He also has frontier-leading experience advising on complex antitrust, cartel, and merger cases. Kai-Uwe is going to broaden our discussion with some thoughts on the need for evaluation throughout the regulatory lifecycle, the need to empirically specify types of harm, how certain incentive mechanisms could lead to ex-ante avoidance of harms, and how legislation could include provisions for data collection to enable ex-post evaluation. So we only have 40 minutes, or 35, I think, so I'm going to try to keep us tight on timing. After both panelists have had an opportunity to speak, we'll move to around 15 minutes of discussion. I'm going to start with a few questions to get us going, and then we'll open up the floor. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. So as James said, I'm going to talk about how we can use measures of subjective well-being to evaluate the impact of the Online Safety Act. Now you might be thinking, what's this got to do with competition policy? I thought I was at a competition conference. Well, it doesn't have to do with competition policy, but it is about evaluation, and it very much is about the boundaries of digital regulation, because that's very much where the Online Safety Act is at. So what is the Online Safety Act? So you've probably heard of it. It's got a lot of press, and it's there to provide a safer online environment for adults and then particularly for children. Ofcom is the independent regulator who's assigned the task of enforcing the Act. It is writing up various codes of practice in relation to what are illegal harms, so things like the sharing of child sexual abuse imagery, online hate speech, the encouragement or facilitation of suicide. They're examples of illegal harms. And then those sorts of things apply as well in relation to children, but the list is broader there because they require additional protections, and so things like appropriate, robust age verification to not give as easy access to pornography sites fall into that category. So what are we hoping that the Online Safety Act will do? It should make it less likely that children encounter pornography. It should make it more likely that they're shown appropriate content, that they should not be contacted by an adult that they don't know, and also that they're clear about how to report a problem if they do come across harm, and that something will be done about that. And the graphic here just points to something that we're doing at the moment, gets into the nuts and bolts of things a bit, but one of the measures that we require is that services which are likely to be encountered by children, that they do a risk assessment about what the risks are to those children and how they seek to mitigate them. And evaluation is really important to us. So why is that? Well, first of all, we've got this brand new area of legislation, which we think is important, and the government's put a lot of effort and resources into supporting it. And we want to see if the objectives of the Online Safety Act will be achieved. Will we make the online environment safer for adults and children? And then that's a very broad level objective, and clearly that breaks down, and we've got our internal and published objectives around that. But we're also interested in how the services, that's what we call them, we don't call them platforms, services that we regulate, how they're going to respond to what we are seeking. And the really important thing to get about the Online Safety Act is that it's about systems and processes of the firms which are regulated. So there will still be online harms out there. There will still be unpleasant stuff on the internet, and the purpose is not to go chasing down the particular people that post that unpleasant material. It's much more about the platforms, the services which are allowing a lot of this stuff to be made available, that they have the appropriate systems and processes in place to reduce that and mitigate those sort of risks. So we want to be able to evaluate, are they following those systems and processes as necessary? We're also concerned about unintended consequences. So with any very new area of legislation, it's bound to have some outcomes which you might not have intended. Some of them could be good. We're probably more worried about the ones which we don't want to occur. That could be harm to competition. So I mentioned competition at least. It could also be that more likely there'll be concerns about freedom of speech. And necessarily by restricting examples of hate speech, there'll be people who view that as being, just someone's opinion, and they should be allowed to have their views heard. The impacts of discrete changes by online services. So what do I mean there? So we have our very broad ambitions for what we want the Online Safety Act to look like, and we will go about assessing the impact that has, but we're also interested in something that a specific service does, and how does that change the experience for its users. So for example, recently Twitch, it's an online service you might be familiar with, changed its rules around for content creators, about how they would label content they were putting up online. And we did a lot of very detailed analysis, so econometrics and all the shebang, and we looked at the impact that had, both in terms of the compliance by those content producers, but also by the people who were viewing that material and whether there was any change due to that. So we're interested in the specifics of how the changes by particular sites then impact on users. Evaluation is also important because it shows transparency with what we're doing. It gives accountability. So we're clear what the evidence is. There'll be people who want us to do more and people who want us to do less, and we need to be clear how we're measuring things and help that debate about whether more should be done or less. And then finally, relating to this evaluation life cycle, which you might be able to read, we use all the evidence that we're picking up about whether it's a particular service making changes, a particular measure and the impact that it has. We then feed that back in through the evaluation process, and we can then, when we revisit the codes and we reiterate them, we've got a better code down because we've got a better source of evidence, because we wouldn't pretend that we have all the sources of evidence now to inform our codes, but we would hope by the bedding in of this, we will be better informed next time around. So that takes us to well-being. And why does it take us to well-being? Well, you can measure online safety in perhaps many, many ways, but one thing you might be interested in is the impact it has on people's happiness. It's very clear that people's measures of subjective well-being, particularly young people, have been declining in recent years as the use of various types of social media has grown. That's not to say that that's a causal link, but they certainly are occurring at the same time. So it seems useful to look at well-being and what it might tell us about the Online Safety Act. But we don't know much about well-being, and so we asked someone who did, which is an organisation called State of Life, and we asked them these following questions. So could well-being metrics be used to evaluate the online safety regime, particularly on children? Which, if that is the case, which subjective well-being measures are the useful ones to look at? What does the literature tell us about the relationship between online harms and subjective well-being? And are there existing surveys that we can use, or do we have to make up our own? And then if you have all this evidence, what evaluation methodologies would be feasible and most useful, right? Because while we can track a lot of this stuff about subjective well-being and other sorts of measures, causation might be particularly challenging. And so we asked them to come up with some suggestions about how we could look at causation. And so I'm going to report what State of Life told us. This is their views, not necessarily those of Ofcom. And they told us that yes, well-being is well suited for evaluating the impact of the Online Safety Act. Why is that? Well, you can measure the Online Safety Act in many ways, its impacts, as I said. We could look at how people comply with our various rules, be that producing a risk assessment by the due date, or have they got robust age verification on porn sites. We can also look at third sector civil society bodies who collect collect information on specific harms, and look at that if that tells us something. But it doesn't really give us the bigger picture about the impact that the Online Safety Act might be having in terms of whether it's decreasing people's anxiety or their self-esteem, or just about how they feel about their online life. And well-being is also useful because it's democratic in nature. And what this means is that we clearly are going to make some judgments about what we think is harmful to people, but at least with a subjective well-being measure, they can indicate about their life online and how it feels for them, and whether it's specific harms which they are concerned about most. Is it, how strong is the harm, the feeling they're feeling about a particular type of harm, or actually are they largely fine with it? Well-being is not some hippy-dippy concept which has recently arrived. It's been around for quite a while and has a lot of scientific backing. And notable institutions like the OECD say it's an appropriate thing to look at. And those serious people at the Treasury also recommend using well-being methods when looking at public health interventions, particularly when those public health interventions are costly, risky, or novel, which I think describes a lot of Online Safety Act pretty well. Now, and the final thing is the well-being is a feature, or perhaps a bug, is its adaptation. So when you experience something in your life which increases your well-being or reduces it, you often have a bump in one direction, but then you revert to where you were before. And now that means we might be able to use that adaptation to sort of track well-being, how people's well-being is adapting over time. Or it might mean that there's some suggestions that the types of harms that arise with well-being are not the sort of things where you have adaptation, and that might help us better with identification about whether the changes that we're making have an impact on people's well-being. Okay, so we asked them also what the other metrics are, or the existing metrics are that we should be looking. They recommended looking at the ONS4, particularly the life satisfaction measure, so how satisfied are you with your life today. These have been around for a long time, they're widely used. They have been used as well with children as young as 10, whereas other measures just have not been validated on children. They're useful as well in case you want to do an evaluation in terms of monetary terms about what we're doing here versus the costs, because these things have been monetized by Treasury, and so it assists with that assessment. They also recommended doing domain-specific cognitive measurements, right? So what does that mean? It means not just asking people how are they feeling about their life today generally, but how are they feeling about their life online and about any harms that they've encountered online. They pointed us to existing research, and there's certainly research out there showing a link between online harms and well-being. But those things tend to be cross-sectional. They tend to be about adults rather than children. There's not that much on the cumulative effect of particular online harms or how those different online harms might relate to each other and then to well-being. So there's certainly plenty more room for research in this area. They recommended, they told us that there was no tracker already out there which is looking at both well-being and online harms. So we'll need to do one ourselves. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do our own tracker, which will ask people, and particularly children, about their life online and about their well-being in relation to that. They suggested maybe we talk to people who are running their own surveys. There's lots of people asking well-being questions, and maybe we could ask them to include something in relation to online harms in there. And they said that panel data would be particularly useful to, if we can, to follow people across time rather than just take a cross-sectional approach. And finishing up, what evaluation methods would be most useful? So recognizing that causation is going to be very difficult here, but perfection shouldn't be the enemy of the good. It is certainly worth monitoring the trends over time, right? And this means, if we can, gathering the information on subjective well-being before the Online Safety Act comes in and during its introduction, and then afterwards, and seeing what's happening with those developments. Ideally, then, we would try and relate those things to the interventions that we're making, the Online Safety Act as a whole, or particular changes which services are introducing. How might we do that? Well, they told us to look at RCTs and difference in difference econometrics and explore those things. But there are real issues, ethical issues around approaching some of those things. So clearly, if you split up two groups of children and you want to have the treatment group, which are going to experience some degree of online harm, you can see the ethical issues there. So I'm going to wrap that up there.
Great. Thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. So before we delve in, I'm going to hand over to Kai-Uwe, who's going to help us zoom out and consider the wider picture.
Yeah, let me actually say I really like this approach to kind of online harm, which I think we're seeing much too little in terms of the way that we're thinking about the introduction of legislation, or at least early in legislation before it comes into force, to think about evaluation. And that is really true going all the way back to even conceiving some of the legislation and thinking about the objectives. Because if you have in mind that in the end you want to evaluate and have an obligation to evaluate what you're doing, you also have to think much harder ex ante about what you're actually putting as objectives into the legislation. And so it's indeed true that it's the whole life cycle of evaluation that's absolutely critical. And I think one of the real issues that we have in a lot of the new regulatory instruments that we've come through is that people have not really thought about evaluation in that way, and what success is and what problems are, and follow that up very consistently. And I think if you would be going through some of the legislation, we would see that. It's also a big contrast to kind of what I saw, when was it, like 2016 or 17, when with the CCP we had a meeting with some regulators to discuss how one should regulate price comparison sites, which almost sounds quaint these days, that one was talking about this. And after half an hour of discussion, I kind of raised my hand and asked the question, well, maybe this discussion would be more fruitful if we could hear what you think the concerns actually are. And someone said, that's a very good question, but we really don't have time to think about this because there's a political pressure and the pressure from the public there, et cetera, and we need to do something. I think that leads to really bad regulation if we're doing it in these things, and there are good examples for that as well. Also, partly, if you're not thinking enough about evaluation. There's a really good example from kind of German legislation kind of protecting delivery people, where we have these small delivery companies that are working for some of the larger postal companies, including Amazon, but also others. And there were a lot of concerns about insurance, et cetera, of these kind of things. So legislation came in, They required evaluation, but no one who wrote the legislation was concerned about whether the data in order to do the evaluation would actually be there. And the next thing that happened was there was a new postal law that came in to bring in a new postal regulation, which also wanted to add towards provisions in protecting personnel. And the German Monopolies Commission criticized the legislation and said, well, why don't you wait until you have an evaluation in order to see how effective the previous legislation has been before you're kind of thinking about further measures and thinking about that. That evaluation came out a little bit later and said, well, we couldn't really evaluate that much because we thought institutions A, B, and C as official statistical kind of entities should have that, but they said, no, for our purposes, we're not collecting that data. Okay? What that very clearly says is that if you want to do evaluation and want to enable evaluation, what you actually have to do is within the legislation actually put that down and actually legislate for collecting the data. And that's effectively what's happening in this case, right? And that's really important because otherwise you don't even know that you're not going to have the data available that is necessary. And like in your case, you need to create a new panel in order to even do that. This was kind of done at the Commission when we had the last modernization of state aid. Rules were for schemes. We actually required evaluation, and that meant that the scheme, when it was submitted, already had to give a framework for how evaluation should be done. So I think that's really, really important that these things are being done up front, and that goes into the way that you're actually designing your measures or designing your legislation. And I think one of the things that I really want to point out is how important that is, especially for newer regulation, because I think I very unapologetically kind of think that most of this is really not that much about competition, but a lot of the things, like online safety, are really about non-market transactions that we have, where it's not about price, it's not necessarily about competition, but it's about externalities that we're trying to take account of. And those are things that we've had a lot of trouble with over the years, also in the digital world, and we're sometimes not distinguishing. We're going very, very fast to going, well, what can competition do? And even if someone says, well, but this is a different problem, so regulation should go in there, yes, but how can competition help? I think the first thing is actually identifying what some of these problems were and what one could predict and what we failed to predict and why that is the case. So you can go quite a bit back kind of about kind of the things. Where did, for example, the fake news issue come up? And I remember when I gave my job talk in Michigan, so this was before the year 2000, and gave a talk about search, someone kind of said, look, isn't difficulties in comparing prices something of the past because I have the internet? And so it's going to be really easy to compare. And I actually, without actually understanding the implications of it, said, well, but it also gets a lot cheaper to put a lot of junk on. Well, that's exactly the phenomenon we got, and if I had been a more mature researcher, I might have actually worked on that issue. But it's exactly what the fake news problem is. You can inject a lot of content very, very easily, and the difficulty is actually to distinguish what is what. And that is not regulated through a price. So the question is how to deal with that. There's some people who are thinking about this, but how do you set incentives there for people to actually understand and value something that is true relative to something that is not true, and how is it actually being selected? That's the underlying problem. And then one needs to go in the direction of trying to ask the question, how does one solve it and with what instruments, and how do you evaluate whether you're successful or not? Right? Now, there's some people who have thought about this. Marshall von Alstein at Boston University has done a lot of work on economic incentives in order to kind of certify real news from non-news, et cetera, et cetera. The question is then always the enforcement of these types of systems. I think something very, just a second. I think something very similar is where we have to focus on what really the underlying issue is, and the first order issues is, for example, also in two-sided markets. People are talking about two-sided markets. They say, yes, network effects and indirect network effects are a really big problem. But some of the biggest first-order issues that we've had in two-sided markets have little to do with competition issues, but have something to do with the fact that people behave differently when monetary incentives aren't there. And that's typically in markets where you have the monetization through advertising, and you want to get the advertising up by getting more and more attention. There, you don't pay when you're on Facebook or other social media, and that means other incentives that are much more behavioral are really important. And we know from psychology, for example, that not just positive things are reinforcing, but negative things are reinforcing. So if you want to increase engagement, you just want to bring the emotions up, and your algorithm is going to do that automatically for you, right? So that is really first order, I think, for our society today. But we're still talking about that type of setup primarily in a competition framework, and not in the question of how do we regulate something where we know that that is the psychological mechanism that is also creating a lot of societal problems. So I think online safety, it goes through kind of a lot of other areas in which we kind of have to think about what these issues are. And just to give examples, and then I'm going to shut up because my time is up, but just to give you one of the examples where I think there's, for example, an issue that I see coming up, for example, with the DMA and how we're evaluating the DMA. What's the objective we're officially saying that the DMA has? It's contestability and fairness. Right? What exactly does that mean, and how do we actually evaluate how we're doing this? No one has determined yet how to do that. Right? So the incentive is, of course, to set up an evaluation scheme that tells you that you've done really well. Or it tells you if certain things don't happen, then it's failed and you need to regulate more. Right? And so there's a real failure of setting that up ex ante. So, for example, how should you do evaluation when you're not quite sure whether the outcomes that you were expecting should never have been expected, or whether something else goes wrong? Right? Is it, and I see people going in that direction, they're already talking about it, to say, well, if there's not lots of entries of European firms in these digital markets, then it must have failed. Then we need to regulate more. The question is, if it's really contestability, if it's really about markets being open, should you not look for something else as the evaluation criteria? What people tell you why they haven't come into markets, or what they're doing, or what their hurdles are of the market, in order to evaluate what the actual impact of the legislation has been. And that type of thinking is really crucial in making improvements on the legislation that we have. It's not about having sometimes bad legislation and then improving it, but we need a framework in order to improve that. And so without that type of evaluation, where you've seen the example being set up here, in all of these areas, we're going to get bad outcomes because we're not learning from what we're actually implementing. And I think that's the biggest issue in regulation today. And I really like it to have a really nice example where it's done well.
Very well. Thank you both. So, as mentioned at the start, I'm going to start us off with some general questions and then I'm going to open up to the floor. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for one or two additional questions. So again, stepping back a bit, wanted to ask you a question about the potential for bias when selecting evaluation methods and political interference. I think this kind of touches upon some of the things that you guys have spoken about, so your PCW example as well. Mm-hmm. Both of you have experience as senior regulators, and how do you balance the need for empirically sound evaluation of harm with the possibility that metrics can be politicized and chosen strategically? And what steps do you think that regulatory bodies can take to guard against this? So, I'll let you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I mean, some of Kai-Uwe's comments are really interesting, particularly at the end there about the incentives even for the regulators to set this up in the right way, right? Because you clearly want to set things up where, you know, you went off, you did this work, and you got a gold star at the end because you did exactly what you were supposed to do. But that's not always going to be the case, right? And you might find out that what you thought was well worthwhile doing wasn't quite so well worthwhile after all. And so, like, how do you guard against that? Well, I mean, you've got to have a bit of institutional honesty about that. You probably have to have a bit of scrutiny from the outside. But in terms of, like, specifically what we do, I suppose we just collect as many appropriate metrics as we think are appropriate, right? So you have what we call a theory of change. You've got this idea about, you know, what you want to achieve, what the impact is, what the intermediate steps are, and then how the assumptions that you're going to make, and then the metrics that you're going to have, what's available, what's going to tell you about causation, what's just interesting, directional. You gather all those, and then you publish your evaluation, and you know, the world can then comment on that. So, you know, as long as you do that and you're subject to scrutiny, hopefully that, you know, you've got someone else marking your homework for you.
Great. Okay.
I think what's really important about that is something that was implicit, namely that you're doing it ex ante. That is before kind of self-confirmation bias sets in. Right? And that's the really important thing, that you can still kind of work in the context of saying, well, what's the best thing that we could do in terms of evaluating this before we actually know what we've done and what the outcomes are, or partially seeing the outcomes. Because otherwise that's going to bias your evaluation, and that's what you don't want. So that ex ante step, the front-loaded part of it, is really, really crucial.
Thank you. My second question is about the role of private practice economists in helping to navigate these new regimes. So clients often yearn for greater legal certainty when assessing the risk of regulatory enforcement, and this can be very difficult to provide when the harms that regulations seek to remedy are difficult to measure or quantify. An example of this is the recent enactment of a lot of FDI regimes which regulate against an ambiguous risk to national security. So what role do you see for econometrics in helping businesses to navigate these new digital enforcement regimes?
Shall I go?
Yeah, sorry, maybe Kai-Uwe go first.
Yeah, I think kind of you need to adapt the methods that you actually have, and it's not always kind of an econometrics method. So if you're talking, for example, about FDI or something I can wrap my head around better because I've seen more of it, which is, for example, policies you do in order to assure supply lines, like subsidies policies in order to kind of bring supply lines within your national boundaries in order to have security supply, say on chips or something of that nature. Now, I think what one can do there is adapt methods that you have in other places. For example, in banking, where you do stress testing and ask the question, well, where do the harms, what has to accumulate in order for something bad to happen? What do we need in terms of accumulate things in order to minimize the risk that we're having on something? How bad is that risk? In order to actually do a cost-benefit analysis of the measures that you're taking. And I think that's also something, like on FDI, it seems to me, from what I've heard so far from lawyers, it's very opaque. And so this question of someone who wants to do a merger or wants to do an investment, and then the question is that now risky or not risky? I think that also would be something where one would want to have a more significant systematic type of evaluation, which I think you can. I mean, we have means of evaluating risks. And if we have means of evaluating risk, using that systematically also makes the type of regulation more predictable.
So, with respect to the Online Safety Act, we write down a lot of measures. If you follow those measures, there's going to be a little bit of ambiguity, but if you follow those, you're safe. But you can also do your own thing. So you don't have to follow those. You can take your own measures, which you think are going to have the same outcome. Now you have to convince yourself and ultimately us that they do have the same outcome, and so then you should be evaluating them yourself being the service here. And that's why the example I talked about Twitch earlier on gives some sense of what that might be, right? So I'm not saying that you have to do what we did there, which was quite a detailed evaluation in terms of a lot of data, a lot of analysis, a lot of econometrics. You can't expect all the services to be going out and doing that. But if they want to do their own thing, they need to be gathering evidence to show that it has the desired outcome. And if they want to have the gold standard, we've sort of set out research showing how you might do that.
Great. Thank you both. I think we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open up to the audience as well. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, here at the front, please.
Thank you for your contributions. My question is, to what extent anticipating this evaluation would yield to the confirmation bias you have said? In principle, evaluation should be totally independent from the moment where the policy or the lawmaking took place, for not being subject to such biases. You want an independent team, you want somebody else to look at this from an external point of view, and it's precisely to be able to challenge things that may happen during the conception phase. For example, the political pressure. The evaluator is going to be asking, is the rationale correct? And it's in order to do this, to have the opportunity to challenge the whole conceptual thing and the whole conception political action. There are other things. You're preparing very much the outcomes and the outputs you want to evaluation look in the future. But perhaps the evaluator may want to look at other things. What are the secondary effects? What are the other outputs other outcomes that you didn't take into account? So, although, I acknowledge and I appreciate the effort, no? But in a way, the evaluation should really take place completely independent, because you want someone to mark your exam. Okay, you've done this, but somebody else will be marking your exam.
So I'll maybe hand over to you for that one.
Okay, thanks. So external scrutiny is really important. And I think we have it through various committees. Our senior people have to turn up in front of and explain what the work we're doing. There's lots of stakeholders who are really interested in what we're doing. If we take enforcement action against someone, we'll have the courts scrutinizing what we're doing. So there's a lot there already, but I get your point, right? That, whenever we're evaluating ourselves, do we not have some degree of bias in doing so? Internally, there's a bit of distance. We've got a group of specialized economists who do this sort of work, often looking at the policies that have been introduced. So there's some institutional division there. But yeah, I think it probably depends maybe on some set of circumstances you might have.
There may be an in-between, because you may want to prepare some of the outputs or outcomes down the line, but you shouldn't be preventing or preempting how the evaluation will take place in the future. You should take a bit of distance.
Yes, great.
Yeah, and I think what was described there was through a consultation process and what one should actually be looking at and actually justifying with outside voices on what to do on the evaluation. I think there are actually different layers there of how one could organize it. If you do serious impact assessment, and I think kind of some of the things that I've seen in the Commission were very serious impact assessments, which are done by people who haven't been involved in drawing up the policy, for example. So you want to have that type of separation. I understand kind of still your concern. I also think that there is the sense a difference in setting up the basic framework on how you evaluate, on what criteria, and the actual implementation. And so what we've had in a lot of the evaluation that, for example, the Commission has done in the last years, and some of these also on state aid, was that the actual implementation of the evaluation was actually farmed out to people who bid for that and did that on the basis of their own expertise. CCP has participated in several of these things, usually in consortia with other university universities and so on. But I think it needs a mixture, and you can't completely separate this from the policy setting and the policy institutions. I think what you want to have for that is that process becomes a disciplining device of being very specific about your objectives and what you're trying to achieve. I think it's less probable that kind of through a consultation process where lots of people with relatively little research kind of go in, that's going to have much of a disciplining effect.
Can I just come in very quickly? So what we're really keen on is services providing their data publicly, right? So that researchers can get access to that data through the APIs and then do their own analysis. So again, the Twitch example was because we didn't have to send them a long request for information. A lot of their information was available through the API. We could do the analysis, but other people could also do the analysis. Now, that's not the Online Safety Act, but it does mean if services are willing to make this information available, it's subject to evaluation. Now, the problem with that is that the ones who make the information available might be the ones who get criticized, and that then affects the incentive to provide this information in the first place.
Do we have time for one more, Sean? Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay. This question is really aimed at just a general question on introducing new policy measures. The Online Safety Act, I think, imposes some new costs on firms, which is fine for firms that have profitable operations, but maybe much more difficult to handle for firms that are small. And I imagine you have thought seriously about the possibility of small firms stopping providing products as a result of cost of complying with regulation. So to the extent that small firms and low profit or negative profit firms are being imposed a cost by government, do you think it's maybe appropriate for government somehow to bear the cost of complying with the regulation, because it is a cost that's in a sense being imposed by government?
Government. Clear government question.
Thank you. So there's no doubt that we create a greater regulatory burden. I mean, depending on what the counterfactual is of what else might happen. But yes, we create that burden. That smaller firms, I should say actually the scope of the Online Safety Act, it could encapsulate hundreds of thousands of services depending on how you work with the definitions, right? So there will definitely be small firms in there. They're not all just the Googles and Metas of this world. And a lot of them might not know that they're within scope. But there's still obligations that they have to follow. If they do follow those obligations, that might hit their profitability. I mean, they are risks that come with all regulation. I think your question was, should the government then bear that cost or something? I think looking for the microphone there. Should they bear? I'm not sure exactly how they would do that.
Well, if I think the point is very simple. If a cost is imposed on an organization that's external, and government doesn't take due account of the costs that it imposes on the private sector, government would be expected to impose more regulation than is necessary. So if you actually pay the costs for the firms that are losing money to comply, then I think you would be much more confident that the government regulation would be tailored to be at the appropriate level.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's probably just worth noting that the focus of the Online Safety Act might be partly about the very large providers, but there's lots of very, very small sites out there with very, very nasty material on them, and often they're the ones that we might have to focus our enforcement actions on. So I'm not exactly answering your question, but just to be clear that it's not just all about focusing on the big guys, and we do need to focus on the small ones too, and that might create costs for those who aren't providing bad material out there.
Okay, I think we're
Yeah.
out of time. So yeah, just want to say thank you to our fantastic panelists for the rich and thought-provoking discussion, and thank you to the audience for the engagement.